Welcome to Positive Talk Radio. Our goal is simple: to explore evolving ideas one conversation at a time. So, stay with us as right now we present. And welcome to Positive Talk, everybody. We've got a great conversation that we're going to have today with you. Mike was on the show, was on KKNW with me a week or so ago, and it was such a fun conversation. And we talked about so many things that it's fun to have him back because he is a mental performance coach who helps kids, predominantly teenagers, that are making that transition from being a kid to now facing college or getting drafted, or how to set themselves up for life. And sometimes it takes more than a mom or a dad to figure it out. And so you got to have somebody like Mike, who's a coach that can kind of help mom and dad figure it out, and to tell them when they need to be quiet and and need to let the kid do what the kid needs to do, and that kind of thing. So Mike, welcome to the show. It's such a pleasure to have you here again.
Kevin, that was well said. Thank you so much for having me back.
I tell you, Michael V. Huber, which is HUBER.com. Go there. You'll find out all kinds of information about him. He does podcasts. He's out there doing everything, just trying to do everything like I do. And, but you are working with kids, and prior to us getting on here today, we were talking about what do we want to talk about? How do we want to frame it? And I grew up in the 70s. When I was a football player in high school, I graduated in 75. And so back then, any notoriety you ever got might be in the local newspaper. Not even the like in Seattle, it was the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and the Times. Might not be in those, but it might be like the East Side Journal or one of the secondary magazines that featured local sports. But nowadays, it's everywhere. And kids, how has it changed? Because I know you grew up in the 80s, you youngster, you. But how has it changed from 40, 50 years ago to now?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really big changes that have happened. So I think there's a couple that I'll point to. One is what has been termed the professionalization of youth sport, meaning when we were growing up, we'd go play Little League and we'd get, a t-shirt and a foam trucker hat, and you bring your glove and you go play a game on Saturday and you practice once a week, and that was it. Well, now kids are playing baseball all year round. They're playing multiple teams, or they're playing different sports all year round. They're traveling. They're getting these uniforms that are hundreds and hundreds of dollars, and bats and gloves and all this stuff, shoes that are super expensive, right? So we're accelerating the process for these kids where they're being thrust into this world where there's more money being spent. There's more eyeballs on them. They're spending more time and energy at even 12, 11, 12, 13 years old in their sport. And it becomes more like a job than it is recreation or fun. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and this is more for the high school age kids and certainly college, is social media. Like we talked a little bit about the idea that there's so many eyeballs on these young people, even as they're in their preteens. There's social media accounts that these teams are setting up. Teams are marketing, or clubs are marketing themselves based on performance. We win these championships. We send these kids to these schools, right? And so there's this culture of winning and elite performance at a very young age, which there's definitely some good in it, but then there's also some things that accelerate childhood for kids and make it more stressful, more anxiety inducing, can even cause kids to age out or burn out and withdraw from sport earlier because it's so pressure packed.
And they lose the sense of joy of having the fun of just going and playing the game. I remember when it was just the fun of just playing the game. Nobody was necessarily there. There wasn't any agents there or any of that kind of stuff like there is today. And everybody's got a phone. So everything that happens on the field ends up in somebody's phone, more or less.
Yeah. And from my own experience, what I'll say is, my parents were blue collar people, not super educated. Like sports were secondary, right? My parents didn't care about my sport performance necessarily. They cared about putting food on the table and paying the mortgage and paying the bills. Now we live in a world where people are in general more well to do. There are multiple income families. Many people, most people, statistically go to college, graduate college, right? They're doing much better. And now they're sort of parents are not only they're turning their kids over to the system, like, and I have kids and I do it too. So I'm not absolved from this. You send your kids to sports and they're so busy all year round because not only because you want them to be active, involved, but because it's easier from a logistical standpoint sometimes to have your kids busy than have them at home when you're working or whatever, right? So the parents are now putting their kids into sports all year round and they're investing big money because there's a keep up with the Joneses mentality, or I want my kid to get a scholarship, or I want them to just have the best. And like, I didn't have that. And when I look back on my own experiences as an athlete, I loved sports. I played 3 sports in high school. I captained 2 varsity teams. I mean, baseball is my first love of all time. And I put so much pressure on myself as a baseball player and as an athlete in general. And my parents didn't put any pressure on me. And I still was like, get sick to my stomach at times over baseball. Imagine if my parents were actually putting pressure on me, or they're at every game and sort of just like lording over me. I would have snapped. Right. And so that's kind of what's happening now with a lot of kids. And that's ultimately where I come in terms of the work that I do.
How do you work with a kid who is celebrated in his uh, field expertise, a baseball player, or maybe he's a great pitcher or whatever? How do you keep his head on the ground when he's getting social media and all these other outlets that are saying, "Oh, he's great, he's wonderful, he's going to be the next Sandy Koufax"? If you don't know who Sandy Koufax is, look it up. But or Todd Drysdale or any of the or Jim Palmer or any of those guys. How do you keep their head from exploding?
Well, I think it's easier said than done, right? Because by the time I start to work with a lot of athletes, they are in the teenage years. They're 16, 17, 18. Sometimes they even come to me when they start college. At that point, they've already developed thought patterns, ways of thinking, ways of coping. They have a worldview. And so, if that's their worldview of like, hey, I'm externally motivated, meaning I'm motivated by rewards and recognition and other people noticing me, that's not the easiest thing to sort of undo. But the work that I do is really steeped in self awareness, focusing on what you can and can't control, right? And really starting to sort of infuse these concepts of, hey, you can buy into all of those things that are outside of you, but you don't control them. And when you buy into something you can't control and you don't get the response that you want, it's going to create a lot of negative feelings, anxiety, stress, right? So finding ways to put things into perspective, right? To get things into perspective, to say, hey, this is just a game. Sure, I love my sport. Yes, I want to be good at it, but it's not the end of the world if I have one bad game or one bad day or even a bad week, right? And then give them the tools ultimately once they've built their self awareness, give them strategies to use in those moments on their own when I'm not there, so that they say, okay, I know this is what's going on. I know I'm having negative thoughts. I know I'm feeling like crap. I'm beating myself up. I'm struggling. This is what I can do now to get myself back into the present moment, which is something I'll talk a lot about, is being present rather than being distracted by something that's going to happen in the future, or being distracted by something that's happened in the past.
How do you keep now? Baseball was your sport. It was my sport too, and I was a catcher for a long time. And when I was playing and I wasn't thinking about it, I did much better than when I was worrying about it and thinking about it. How do you keep a kid from thinking to himself, "Oh, I'm going to strike out here. The bases are loaded, and I got a good pitcher up. I'm going to look foolish. He's going to strike me out." How do you keep the mental side of the game from overtaking a kid like that?
I mean, that's a great question. And it's probably like the quintessential, it's like a microcosm of my work, right? Because one, the brain is predisposed to protect us from threat, right? And those situations for most people, Like when you're in a pressure situation and I'm facing somebody who I perceive to be better than me or really good, or I've got runners on base and it's a close game, those are threatening situations a lot of times for people because they're going, I don't want to screw up. And that natural inclination to say, don't screw up, makes it even harder to perform in a natural way, right? Doing that thing physically that your body's done so many times before, and you're fighting against yourself. Your mind is getting in the way of what your body can do. So it's like sort of recognizing that that's sort of the baseline for most people. Then it's a matter of with a lot of athletes, particularly those teens and college age kids, it's really getting them to focus on the process. Again, what they can control. Um, Sometimes it's a distraction, right? Like what I mean by that is if I'm having a negative thought about myself and my ability to perform in that moment or feeling overwhelmed, like I could either distract myself with something that's like neutral or outside of myself, or I could even distract myself with a phrase or a saying that's completely like nonsensical, just as a way to turn your brain off. Like I've done that with other kids. Like they get so wrapped up. I'm like, say something funny to yourself. It's like the old adage, like when you're giving a presentation in class, imagine your classmates unclothed and everybody laughs and they sort of loosen up. I don't do that, but it's like, hey, think of a word or a phrase or something funny to take your mind off of what you're about to do so that your body can just go do it. But it takes a lot of work and time because you're undoing patterns that have been, accumulated over time. And biologically, that's the default setting of the biochemistry of the brain.
Now, this is for those of you that are not sports aficionados like I am, which is you see a guy coming up to bat. He does the same routine every time. He'll take this glove and he'll tighten it, and then he'll take this glove and he'll tighten it, and he'll take his hat and he'll move it, and then he'll take it. Takes the same as even to this point of of, of wiping the dirt a couple of times as he's getting into the batter's box. Why do they do that? Is that just habit, or is there a method behind it?
Well, I think in general, a routine of any kind is really, really helpful, right? And sticking to a routine, if it works for you, is great. I think the challenge with some of the routines, like even like the kind of routine you're describing, is the balance or the break point between a routine and a superstition, right? Superstitions are like, I have to do this or else, versus I have a routine because I want to feel comfortable that I'm doing the same thing automatically every time. One, that routine can be a distraction, but it can be a source of comfort. Now, there are certain things that I like to build into routines that I think are more helpful than just tightening your batting gloves or wiping, wiping the dirt with your cleats or tapping your bat on the mound. It might incorporate deep breathing, putting in a deep breath to relax your muscles, to slow your heart down, to clear your mind. That's always something that I encourage. Sometimes it might be saying something to yourself that resets you or sets you for what's about to come, or picking a point of focus if you're a batter or you're a pitcher, picking a point of focus outside of you and then going to that point of focus, right? So there's things that you can do that are more strategic than just some of the sort of the rituals that you see players do, but that's important too, because if you're doing something different every single time, now you're worried about like what my routine is going to be, and that just puts more like noise into the system that you don't need when you're trying to hit a ball moving at 90 miles an hour.
Which, by the way, is not an easy thing to do. It's one of
It
the
is not.
toughest things to do that there is. What I was just thinking now, there are like pitchers that as they come off the mound after an inning, they will not step on the line. And but what happens if somebody, and it's a superstition that they won't step on the line? What happens if they accidentally do? Are they now trashing themselves?
Um, I think the answer is it depends, right? So like when I played baseball, I would jump over the line too. But if I stepped on the line by accident because I wasn't paying attention, like it wasn't something that would have set me into a tailspin. It was just something I did. It was like a fun thing to do, jump over the line. It was kind of like a little bit of a game. But I think there are players in sports out there who are so superstitious that if they don't wear a certain item of clothing, or they don't, do a certain thing, or they don't jump over the line, that could spiral them out of control. And that would be an example of somebody that I would want to work with to say, hey, like, you're putting too much stock into this, because the reality is that you stepping on the line or not wearing a t-shirt has nothing to do with your ability to perform, right? It's really just something that you've convinced yourself is real. And it's only making it harder for you rather than making it easier. So I think I'd even step back to say, like, in terms of the work that I do, it really is, I try to make it as personal and customized as I can, because every person is different. They come from a different place. They have different experiences. They have different ways of thinking. They may even have, mental health issues that are beyond sport. They may have family issues. Like, all these things impact the way people look at the world. And I have to understand that, so that when I'm helping them solve their problems or giving them strategies, like, I'm taking that into account, because not everything is going to resonate with everybody that I work with.
What's the percentage of high school baseball players who make it to the major leagues and have a major league career? Do you know what the percentage is?
I don't know the odds, but the number is ridiculously small. I could probably do the math for you, but it would be boring for you and everybody else. But I mean, now in the major leagues, put it this way, they have 20 rounds of draft. They cut it in half. So there's basically 600 players, 700 players drafted any given year, out of that includes high school and college players. So that's tens of thousands of baseball players who are draft eligible, high school seniors and college players, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, and the vast majority don't get drafted, right? So the idea that you're going to play professional baseball, I think is I think everybody needs to have a dream, but your effort and your energy and what you do needs to be aligned with that dream, right? And that's sort of that's the contradiction with what I was saying to you before about the professionalization of sport, is that in some ways the kids who want to be professional athletes, they do have to start at 12, 13, 14 years old, putting in that intense effort and skill building, because it's so competitive. Now, that's a catch 22. But I think what most people tell me now, like any athlete tells me, I just want to go as far as I can go, meaning I want to play till I know I can't play anymore. And if I do that, I'm good, rather than if I don't make the pros, it's a failure, right? So I think people are realistic about it. I think it's more a focus on college than pros. I think a lot of kids want to be college athletes, particularly Division I scholarship athletes. Like, that's sort of the gold standard of, hey, I made it. All this work was worth it. Now I get the recognition that people see me as a Division I athlete, right? And I think that's the carrot.
And it also saves their parents a bucket load of money.
Yeah, and let's talk about that, because what I do find is, listen, there are very, very few parents, if any, who hang that over a kid's head and they say, hey, I need you to get a scholarship, right? Or I'm spending all this money and investing all this money in your development as a player athlete. Like, you need to get a scholarship or else. That rarely happens. I'm sure it does, but I don't see it. Right. What I see is, hey, we're spending the money. We want the kid to be happy. We want to give them the best chance to succeed. But if they don't play in college, or they don't, get drafted, or they only play Division III, whatever, it's okay. But the kids internalize it anyway. They see mom and dad are driving for hours. Now they're getting on planes. They're spending thousands of dollars for league fees and equipment and all these things. The kids know, they don't know the exact numbers, but they know mom and dad are really knocking themselves out to give them everything they want. So there is a sense, a lot of times, I think implicitly from the kid, that, hey, I don't want to let mom and dad down. And so thus it becomes a cycle of, like, there's expectation, disappointment. If they're not communicating, then there's, like, a misinterpretation of who wants what. And that even puts stress into the system. And that's just family dynamics 101. Forget about sports. We all go through it.
Oh, exactly. And the other thing that I'm hearing about now, that has been going on for the last couple 3 years, especially in college athletics, there's been a change that now they can have an agent when they're it's in football specifically. I'm thinking, I don't know whether that's true or not, but that they can actually sign as a college athletes sign promotional deals with companies and that sort of thing, and have an agent and stuff like that. Is that true? And how is that affecting um, the schools?
So it's I'm not an expert in it, but I do I'm around it enough or I'm familiar enough where I could give you the basics. So yes, that is true. So where it used to be that you couldn't make money, monetize your name, image, and likeness. They call it NIL. You couldn't monetize that as an athlete because that would violate your eligibility as an amateur. Now it's allowed. So you can go and sign a deal with a local car dealership where you promote, you show up on Instagram and you promote the dealership, or you promote more likely a lot of times it's like a food product, energy drink, or whatever. I mean, there's any range of things, and they can go and they can get an agent as it relates specifically to that, right? Not necessarily an agent to, you know, assess their professional opportunities in sport, but more a marketing agent. So yeah, so that's happening at the college level. So listen, I mean, the upshot of it is that by and large, college kids have more money, right? Which not necessarily a bad thing. We could debate that. I don't really want to have an opinion, but it's not really for me to say, in this forum. But um, I think having money in their pocket is sort of the difference. And what's happening is a lot of kids are staying in school longer because they can make money in college now, and they don't have to go into the draft early, or they don't have to worry about money, so they can enjoy their college experience. The other thing that comes with it is the transfer portal. Are you familiar with the transfer portal?
That was my next question.
So when you couple those two together, what's happening is that kids are moving around from college to college to college. If they're not happy in a situation as a freshman, they're entering the transfer portal, and then they're basically shopping themselves to reopen their recruitment so they can go to a school where they could play more, presumably, or maybe have even more NIL opportunities, more monetize, more opportunities to monetize their likeness. Right. And so what's happening is that kids are moving around and they're staying in college longer too for that reason. And so colleges are recruiting kids out of the transfer portal because they're experienced at the college level. So if I'm a college coach, I say, well, I can go get this sophomore or junior player or even a senior who wants to transfer because he's been playing for 2 or 3 years, which means the high school kid doesn't get as many opportunities because they'd rather recruit the kid who's been in college rather than the unknown entity. And what's happening there is that it's creating a lot of anxiety for high school kids who are offered scholarships, right? They're committed to a school and the school's offered a scholarship verbally, but they haven't signed their letter of intent yet. And what's happening, or at least there's a fear of it from the high school player, is they're going to pull my scholarship and give it to a transfer portal kid. And because they're more experienced, I'm going to get a better kid from an existing college pool than a high school kid. And so the kids are worried, like, I have to continue to perform because I'm not guaranteed anything as a high school player until I sign on the dotted line, which is like, not until your senior year.
Well, what happened last year with the Huskies is that they had a guy that was a really high touted high school athlete from the local area. And I won't use his name, but um, so he signed with the Huskies as a freshman, and they also signed another guy as a freshman who won the job. And so that meant that he was going to be behind that guy for the next 4 years or as long as that guy stayed. So he ended up opting out and transferring someplace else that he thought that maybe he could play and make a little bit more money. Does that happen a lot too?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if I had to guess, because I don't know for sure, because you don't know what is in anybody's head, and I don't know that there's any data. But if I have to guess, right, like the vast majority of kids who are going into the transfer portal, it's because of playing time, right? And so I think you could argue it both ways, right? Like, okay, I thought I was going to come in. I was maybe promised, and listen, this happens in recruiting. You're promised things. You're going to come in and play right away. You're a really big part of the program. And then you come in and you're not starting and you're sort of relegated because you're kind of starting from scratch and you maybe feel like you're, sold a bill of goods. And if you want to leave under that premise, like, hey, listen, I believe that you should have the freedom to do that. But I think it's a slippery slope where you come in and you're beat out by somebody who's maybe a lower level recruit, but they beat you out on the field in competition, right? Are you leaving the school because you got beat out, or should you stay and continue to compete to try to win that job, or maybe switch your position or whatever, right? And so I think there's a fine line between, hey, I'm going into the portal because I'm out playing and there's a really good reason, versus like, hey, I just don't want to fight for this job and I'm gonna bail because it's easier to do that than stay and fight. Again, I don't begrudge anybody anything, but I think those are the two sides of the argument.
Well, and I will tell you that that comes back to roost when you are going up to for the draft. They look at that kind of information. Were you willing to stick through it and to compete, or did you quit to go someplace else? That matters to the pros.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that's from a character standpoint that could be looked at as somebody who's not willing to sort of hold firm in their commitments to stay and compete and stick it out and try to develop as a player. Because listen, there's 4 or 5 years in college. Development happens. Kids come in as unheralded recruits and they develop into starters and they develop into professional players because they stay the course and they're focusing on what they can control, which is their development in the weight room, their development on the field. So, like, that's the kind of kid that a lot of teams will look for. I think the other thing that I would like to talk about as it relates to that is, one of the things I talk to my clients a lot about is, why are you picking a particular college? And I think there's such a singular focus on prestige. Like, I'm going to UW, I'm wearing the purple, we're tricked out, we're on TV, right? All those things, blah, 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 blah. But you're not thinking about, a lot of kids aren't thinking about academics. They're not thinking about the distance from home. They're not thinking about, am I going to be comfortable living on a big campus like that in a city, or would I be more comfortable at a smaller campus, right? In a rural area or whatever it is, right? There's so many factors other than just the amount of a scholarship or the prestige of a program that should drive decision making. Because if you choose a school, say UW, because you love being in a city and you love Seattle and it has your major and all these things, maybe if you're not a starter right away, you stick it out because there's other reasons to be there. If football or whatever your sport is the only reason to be at a school, you're probably much more likely to transfer out when things don't go the way you want them to on the field.
Now, that is something I would imagine that in your work and your coaching and when you're talking to these kids, that has to come up in what you're doing and what you're talking to them about, because it is an overall program. And I really think that, and I'd like your opinion on this. I really think that education is, they get a free education, but that's the key. If they can get out of college, even if they don't get drafted, and they've got an education, that's going to serve them well for their entire life. Whereas if they just go and skate by, so is that something that you have a nice heart to heart talk? And your point is well taken about, should you go to Michigan, as an example, which has got this heralded program, and the best and the brightest and the best football players go there? Or should you go to, I don't know, East Michigan, which is a little bit smaller? You got a better chance to play, and it might have your major, and you can, and it's a smaller school. If you're a small kid, do you go through and have that discussion with these kids?
I have with certain kids. I mean, some of them when they come to me are already committed to their school. They've already chosen where they want to go, and we wouldn't necessarily revisit that or try to, like, reinvent the wheel. We'd move on in terms of focusing on what they're trying to accomplish. But I have had kids who are uncommitted or hadn't started the recruiting process yet, who are talking about schools randomly, like, I want to go here because, again, it's a big name, I'd like to be there, whatever. It's all hearsay. And they're not really researching it. So yeah, like, my advice to them is, think about what your values are. Like, what's important to you. And I think it's an exercise that I actually try to go through a lot with athletes, is not even as it relates to college selection, but in general, like, what's important to you in your life? Like, everything. Like, let's prioritize. Like, what are you about? Like, what is most important? And if, sports are the most important thing and everything else is down here, well, that's going to drive your decision making, and that's fine. But just be aware that if things don't go the way you want it to in sports and everything else is down here, you're probably going to feel pretty crappy about yourself, right? So really trying to get a sense of what's important, how do we balance it a little better, and really thinking through, like, logically and rationally about, like, what's the best fit for me. I mean, you never can guarantee anything, right? We all make choices with the information we have, and sometimes those choices don't go the way we want them to, even though we've done our homework, and that's okay, right? It's like, but at least give yourself the chance to prepare and think through it rather than just being like, yeah, I'm going to go there because they're the first one that offered me, or I'm going to go there because I love their uniforms. I mean, those are extreme examples, but it's it happens.
I I'll bet it does. I'll bet it does. What is it like? Because it's been a while, but I did have a couple of boys that were 18 at one time, and they were not fully developed yet. They were emotionally immature, and they were not men. How do you work with an 18-year-old who is just, in my world, barely out of diapers, and is making these lifelong decisions of degrees and what they're going to do, and being in sports and all of that? How can you help somebody who is immature?
It's a really great question, and it's a really hard one to answer because you're right. I think by and large, especially males from an emotional standpoint, are not they're not near fully developed, right? And they are sometimes they're reactionary, they're not thinking straight, they're willing to take risks or make decisions on a whim because that's just where they are developmentally. For me, like, listen, to boil it down, I would say usually it's the kids who are in general more emotionally mature and more motivated that tend to do better when they're working with me. The ones who are less, and sometimes it takes a little bit of time for me to figure that out, like 2 or 3 or 4 coaching sessions to be like, "Hey, maybe you're not ready for this, or you're not into this, or you kind of want to do things your own way." And that's fine. Like, I get it. Like, it's not for everybody, but it's like up to me to assess, like, does this person have the motivation to invest and engage in a process like one that I'm doing? Um, and stick with it and really get the most out of it. Cause otherwise, then it's a waste of everybody's time and money. It's also on me a bit to meet them where they're at, which means, like, if they are a little bit more emotionally immature, but they want to get better and they're invested, then I have to figure out ways to connect with them. Right. That's my job, to understand them, to have empathy, to connect with where they're at and be like, okay, like, what can we do that this kid's going to understand that makes sense to him so that he could implement it and get better? It's really hard, but it's rewarding, if you could stick with it and make it work.
By the way, we're talking with Mike Harbor or Huber, excuse me. If you go, I can't read. If you go to michaelvhuber.com, you can find out more information about him. I would suspect that there's somebody that's listening to us who's a parent and is saying, especially if single mom, if dad's not around or passed away or something, they need the support of a male who can reach their kid differently than they can, because mom can't never reach a 18-year-old child the way that you might be able to. So do you find that when people talk to you about coming and coaching, two things: number one, do you find that when they ask for you to come work with them, that they're willing to give you the tools that you need to help their kid? Number one. And number two, if you have to if you go to work for somebody, do you and the parents or parent have a long conversation before you begin with the kid?
So I'll answer the questions in reverse. Yes.
Perfect.
So not only do I talk to them before I usually get to the kid, I have a long conversation about what their perception of the situation is and what the kid needs. I'm talking to them on a regular basis. We don't necessarily have set meetings, but I'll do check-ins with them. Hey, this is where, Johnny or Mary is at. I'll send an email or a text, right? Or they'll be like, hey, I'm having some issues. I'm seeing some things that are odd. Can we talk? And we'll get on a phone call, when they need, right? Because I think what happens with young people, to tie it back to the original question about maturity, emotional maturity, I think sometimes the kids tell me one thing through their eyes. It's not a lie. That's what they perceive and see of themselves. And mom and dad see something completely different. And I don't know it because I don't hear it. So, like, I'm getting only one side of the story. The other side of the story is no, that's not happening. Like, I'm seeing something totally different. So my job in our sports psychology language, we call that triangulation, which is basically taking information from different sources and trying to fit them together to figure out what's the whole picture. What's the true story, right? There's, your version of truth, my version of the truth, and somewhere in between. That's kind of what it is. And my job is to figure out what that is. So I'm constantly, and it depends on the parent. Some parents are really hands-on. Some people are really hands-off. Um, that's okay to an extent. But to your question, most of the parents who come to me, whether it's a single parent, divorced parents, married parents, it really doesn't matter. What I would say is most parents who come to me are really motivated to get their kid help because they're recognizing that, hey, like this has become so complicated and complex between us and for my child that I can't help them anymore. Or I can't help them in the way that somebody like you can because we've kind of hit, a dead end. And that means when they come to me, they're kind of coming hat in hand with some humility saying, like, I want you to help me. They're not fighting back or they're saying, hey, I'm giving you the permission to go help my kid because I just want them to be happy and okay.
I got to ask you because it's changing ever always. It's always changing, but now there are principalities like Washington, like Colorado, like California that allow that pot is not illegal anymore. So, do you sense that kids are in getting more involved with recreational drugs, even if they're an athlete because I know athletes have had their tests done and they've been had substance abuse and that kind of stuff. Do you talk to them about that? Is that even an issue for the kids?
Well, so I think it's a really hard question to answer. I think one, because by and large, my experiences are I don't have kids who engage in that behavior. At least I don't know. Like, it's not like the kid will tell me. The parents don't. I've never had really a parent come to me and say, "Oh, they're caught up in this and it's really affecting their play." Even alcohol. Like, I don't. It doesn't come as an issue to me. Doesn't mean it's not there, but parents haven't, like, historically haven't come to me and said, "Oh, my kid's drinking or they're doing drugs or whatever." So it's really hard for me to say. I mean, I know it's out there. I just don't know if it's because the athletes really are hyper focused on performance that they're not doing it, right? Because it's so competitive and it's so high pressure. They don't want to ruin their ability to perform and get those scholarships and ultimately go pro. Or it's because it's something that's just swept under the rug and we don't talk about it. So the honest answer is I'm not sure.
Like, Dad, how old are your kids?
They're going on 15 and 13, so teenagers.
Well, you got a few years to go because my youngest, when he was going through high school, and then I found out in his early 20s, we were sitting down in a bar having a beer because he's of age and stuff. He told me some stories about stuff that he did when he was in high school that I never knew about. So,
Well, I think that's an important point, and not necessarily as it relates to doing, recreational drugs in high school or before drinking underage, but I think in general of this idea that we have to let our children, and I subscribe to this theory as a parent, but just in general, like, they have to make their own choices. They have to be equipped to make their own choices, and they have to be equipped to make mistakes and fall on their face, right? And so I think what happens in the sporting athletic environment is parents are so hands-on and they want to be so involved, whether it's living vicariously through their kid, being over involved, and whether it's in the stands or just like being hyper intense about them always doing their thing. They're not giving the kid the chance to make their own choices. Do I even want to play? Right? I feel pressured into playing, or I want to take a day off, but I can't, or I don't want to play this summer. I just want to be with my friends, or whatever it is, right? Rather than letting the kids make those choices and understanding that it's okay, but there's going to be a consequence from a performance perspective if you don't do this, rather than forcing them to do it and saying, you have to do this or else. And then it becomes this activity that becomes involuntary and it affects motivation. It leads to burnout, right? So parents, like, just letting their kids make their own choices to an extent, right? You don't want them to be unsafe, but if they're not in danger, letting them make their own choices, and you having, as a parent, having to live with the consequences just like they do.
And that's a part of life. Is
Sure is.
you make your choices and you sit down and then you got to deal with the choices that you made.
Exactly. Exactly. And it gives them a sense of agency, especially in those teenage years where they're exerting their independence. They want to make their own choices. They don't want to have to look to you for everything. And giving them the opportunity to make those choices, even if it's just sort of ones that are not high risk, but saying, hey, okay, if you don't want to play on this team or this summer, or you don't want to work out, that's okay. But, and I do this with my own kids, just understand there's a consequence. There's a consequence to what you eat. There's a consequence to when you go to bed. There's a consequence to when you practice, all those things. And if you don't do that, or you do what you want to do, that's fine. But then when you come on Sunday and say, I didn't play great, I felt sluggish, or like I was really tired, or whatever, like, that's on you. It's not on me. I'm not going to force you to do it. But now, you just learned from the experience. You might want to change something because you're not playing great.
Exactly, and everything has consequences. My son went through that when he was in football. He got in with the wrong crowd, and they convinced him to quit the team when he was so he came to me and said, "Well, I'm gonna quit the team. I'm not playing enough." And da, da, da. And I said, "Well, you do understand that if you quit now, you can't go back, or if you do go back, there are going to be consequences." And he said, "Yeah, I get it." So next year he decided to go back. And yes, there were consequences.
Yeah.
But to his um to his credit, he made it through the entire season. He didn't throw up his finger and say I quit. He made it through.
Yeah.
And that was a life lesson that was more important than him starting or playing well.
Right. And I think that that's something we probably hear often is like, sports really creates the environment for kids to build character, right? The idea that they can make their own choices, they can learn these lessons, they're going to fail, right? They're going to work hard, and sometimes things aren't going to go their way, or sometimes they're going to quit, right? And they're going to go, I made a bad choice. I'm going to go back and then have to bite the bullet because I left for a year. Those are all things that we take with us, because all of us, I talk to this, all my athletes about this, all my clients, you're going to retire at some point, right? Whether it's at the end of high school, at the end of college, maybe you're lucky enough to play pro. But by the time you're 30 years old, and for most of us 20s, that's it. Like, it's over, right? You got to move on to the next phase of life. And that, you need to have to learn how to deal with that before you get there, rather than getting to a place where now I'm done as an athlete. That's the only piece of my identity that I know. And now I'm depressed. I'm anxious. I'm doing things that probably aren't good for me because I don't know how to cope with not being an athlete, because that's who I was. So that's something that comes up a lot for me in my work, and it comes up for a lot on my podcast. I talk to a lot of former athletes who talk about their experiences post retirement and really struggling with who am I and what am I going to do?
Your podcast name is?
The Freshman Foundation.
I love that, by the way,
Thank you.
and go to his podcast. It really is insightful, because one of the things that I think that we do a disservice to our youth, especially the talented ones, the who have rarefied air, that they grow up in little league and pony league and high school, and everybody thinks that they're just wonderful. And then at one point in time, they no longer can be who they once were, but they have no identity. They don't know who they are. They can't fall back on, I'm a hell of a writer, or I love talking to people, and I'm a great salesman, because they didn't invest the time. Because you found that a lot in the people that call your show, huh?
Yeah, definitely. It's actually interesting. I remember my very first episode, which came out in the beginning of 2021, was with a kid who I coached in high school. And he went on to play college baseball. He's playing college baseball now. And we talked about it. And he was in his first semester of school. And actually, one of the things I remember him saying very vividly is like, finding something outside of baseball was really important to him, right? Find something that you like outside your sport, because otherwise it'll drive you crazy, because you're going to live, eat, and breathe it. And if it doesn't go well, or that's all you have, you're going to really struggle, right? And I think you're right. It's like, what's my purpose outside of sport? What do I want to do for a living? Who do I want to surround myself with? Do I have a hobby? Like, those things are really important, so that when you get to the next step and sports gone, you're like, hey, now I'm going to be an entrepreneur. That comes out a lot in my podcast. I have a lot of entrepreneurs who are ex-athletes who say, hey, like, now I want to go build something and be like an athlete, where you're like investing all this time, energy, even money in certain instances, to build a business. And it's sort of like being an athlete, because there's no guaranteed return, but you're like putting all your heart and soul into it. And that's a really common theme that I see with my guests.
Well, I hope that as many of them as possible can be successful. Because keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that your average kid in high school, they don't even teach him how to balance a checkbook. And so he gets to be 18 years old, and some organization offers him $100,000 cash to sign on the dotted line. He's now has got this bank account with all this money in it, but he has no idea how to manage it, and it disappears more times than not, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I don't can't speak to that, but I think you're generally you're on to something, right? It's even, I see it with my own children. The things that kids learn in school are things that I know they're never going to use, and when they say they're never going to use it, they're right. Like, I can't lie to them, right? They don't teach them how to, financial literacy, really, right? They don't
No.
teach them emotional coping skills, right? They don't teach them goal setting. They don't teach them all these practical things that we need to learn how to do in our adult life, and we don't use the historical facts, right? Like, oh, the war of whatever, in this country, in this date, like, we're never going to use that unless we're going to be a history professor or whatever, right? So, like, I think there's this element of like, hey, like, giving them more life skills is really important. And I think that's kind of where I fill a gap with kids, is giving them life skills that are going to translate into later in life, post sport. So I think when parents come to me, they realize it's not just helping them now and to compete and perform, but it's going to help them for the rest of their life when they go off to college or when they go into the workforce, that they're going to have these tools that they didn't have or didn't learn in school.
Day before yesterday, I got a piece of mail that said, "You have been awarded this great credit line with this company, and we're going to transfer everything that of all your accounts, and we'll transfer it to this one." And and then in the fine print, it said, which they don't tell kids about, the interest rate was 27.5%. You could pay minimum on that for the rest of your life and never pay it off.
Yep.
And they don't tell kids in school how to manage a checkbook, how to deal with credit and stuff. So these kids get to college, and in a lot of cases, mom gives them a credit card, bad idea, and then they blow their money because they don't know how to use it.
Well, yeah, or we go back to the conversation we were having before, which is like, if they're earning money through name, image, and likeness, and they're getting a check for 5 grand or 10 grand or 20 grand, and some of these kids, the more higher profile ones, are making hundreds of thousands and millions. Like, what are they doing with the money, right? What are they spending it on, right? Are they getting themselves into trouble? Are they investing it? Are they saving it, right? Like, those things are even more valuable. And I think, in truth, I think the colleges certainly are starting to catch up to that. They know that they need to teach their kids, like, hey, if you're going to have this money, this is what you need to do with it. And really starting to build in life skills programming, because it's a much different world than it was even 5 years ago, where you just came in, got a scholarship, and that was it. And your only financial planning was, well, where am I to get money to eat my meal today, because I don't have any.
How do you help? Because I know that statistically speaking, the odds of a kid going through college, getting drafted, making millions of dollars is very small.
Yes.
But there are guys that do that. How do you, do you ever have that conversation with somebody about the hangers on, the guys that are not the friends that are there, that they take, that end up eating up their money and stuff like that?
I haven't had to. I haven't had to. I have had a couple of college kids who, are on the precipice of playing professional sports. Um, but I've never found myself in that situation. But I think I kind of go back to the foundational stuff that I've talked a little bit about here, right? Like decision making is something that I would consider in the realm of my work, right?
Yeah.
One, what do you value? That's part of it. I've talked about that. But just looking at the pros and cons, like, okay, like it's not that complicated, right? Like, okay, if I make this decision, what are the pros and what are the cons? Like I've done this with kids before. Make a T chart. Tell me the pros and tell me the cons. Okay. Which one outnumbers the other? Like, okay, let's think about this logically so that like you can think about a decision rather than just making an emotional decision, right? Making a decision where like, well, I have to do this for somebody because they're putting pressure on me or I want them to like me versus like, no, I need to protect myself. I'm not against making the decision, but I need to understand what both sides of the equation are. So that is something that I would help kids with because I think decision making is something that we just tend to learn through osmosis. We're not taught about it. We learn through doing and we fall on our face and get up and keep going until we figure it out, which for some of us like myself takes 40 years to figure out.
Yeah. I'm right there with you. I'm right there with you. Well, and Charles Barkley, the basketball player, tells a story about he was having a conversation with I think name escapes me, but I think it was Michael Jordan. And Jordan said, "How many cars do you have?" And Charles said, "Well, I got 6." Said, "How many can you drive at the same time?" "Well, one." "Well, why do you have 6?" "'Cause I like cars. I want 6." It's like, do you realize you're just sitting there and they're not making it so so Barkley sold for him
Right.
because he realized that was a really dumb idea and a lousy way to store your money.
It's a really good example, right? And it can apply for athletes of like, where are you not only spending your money, but where are you spending your time, right? Am I putting my time, which is finite, into buckets, doing things that aren't really that valuable or important? Like, then I'm wasting a valuable commodity, right? Thinking about like what are the one or two or three things that are most important. So when I spend my time, I know I'm getting something out of it versus like spreading myself really thin or doing something to make somebody else happy, right? So like the same principles apply there. And I think it's just being more mindful about what's important to you and like what the consequences are and being more measured in like your decisions. And like I think a lot of kids just aren't taught to think that way. And I like to contribute in that way if I feel like a kid needs support in that manner.
I and I really hope that you can convince some kids. I hear every now and again about this an altercation that may happen in like a strip club, and I'm going, well, these are just kids. Well, it's like they're in their early 20s and they're famous and they're going to a strip club. Those things just don't work for you very well if you're going to maintain your reputation and that kind of stuff. But that happens as well. So
Well, I mean, listen, most professional leagues, NBA, NFL, I'm sure baseball does. When kids are coming into the league, rookies are coming into the league, they're educating them on this stuff. To what level, I'm not exactly sure. But they're telling them, hey, like be careful about where you putting yourself, where you're going, who you're going with, what kind of money you're spending. Like they're giving them at least like the heads up, like you shouldn't do this. The truth of the matter is, listen, the brain doesn't fully form until 25 years old. Meaning, if you're 22 and your decision making function in your brain is still not all the way where it needs to be, like you're gonna do dumb stuff, right? And that's it, it's going to happen sometimes, but that's the lesson of okay, now what are the consequences? What am I going to learn from it? Do I have a growth mindset? Like, obviously when there are, legal consequences or financial consequences, it's a pretty big deal and you're in the public eye. But can you look at a situation where maybe you made a mistake and view it as an opportunity to get better and grow and change your behavior? Or do you look at it as like, oh, like, I'm a victim or whatever, right? And that's definitely something I talk to kids about is, are you viewing these failures, this adversity as an opportunity to be more resilient, to learn something new? That's just a different perspective, right? And that takes work because our natural default setting is gloom and doom for a lot of us.
exactly. By the way, we've been talking with Michael V. Huber, and your podcast again is
Foundation.
Freshman Foundation. Go do that, and I'm going to stand aside. I'd like you to tell our audience, especially those moms and dads out there that may have a budding superstar in their household, tell them anything you would like them to know.
Well, I think the most important thing I could tell you is that you have to do what's best for your child, right? And I think being honest in your assessment of what that is really important, because sometimes we think we can help, but we're not always capable of doing that. And somebody like me, I'll just sort of, promote myself here, is like, and
Please
and
do.
and parents and athletes I've worked with will tell you this. Like, I think finding somebody to help you, like me, a mental performance coach, a sports psychology professional, really the most important thing is, do they have my best interest at heart? Are they genuinely interested in helping and being a part of the team? And if that's the case, then you're probably going to find somebody really good to put into your corner to give you yourself as a parent and the kids the resources that they need to survive what has become a much more pressurized and rigorous process. So, what I urge parents to do is to reach out to me, because I want to talk to them. Like you said, like I want to have a conversation with them. I want to understand where they're coming from, what's going on. And then I try to assess from my end, honestly, whether or not I can help. And if I can help, can I point you in the right direction to get the help you need from somebody else, whether it's a clinical professional or somebody else in the field who specializes in some element of sports psychology that might be better than I am to do the job.
Yeah, but start with you first.
You can. I'm always happy to talk to people, because, I think I told you this before, this is my second career. I left my first career about 6 years ago. And like, I got into this field to help people. Like, I'm doing it because I want to help people in this space. And so like my first instinct is always to be, hey, give, give, give. Let's see if I can help. And if I can help and it makes sense, then we could talk about what a coaching arrangement looks like. But there's a couple of steps before we even get to that point. It's just really trying to be an ear to listen to and give some advice and see if there's a fit.
That's why you're on this program.
That's right.
Because you're doing this for the good of other people.
I like to think
and
so.
to help
Yeah.
kids. Yeah. So thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we go?
No, Kevin, you mentioned like 3 or 4 times my website, everything that you could find there. There's free stuff. There's my podcast. There's blog posts, all my socials, my contact. Check that out. There's a lot of free stuff and stuff that's really valuable that you wouldn't even need to reach out to me for to get something from a visit.
You are a busy guy, and it's great to have you here. And I really appreciate you coming along.
Thank you so much for having me, Kevin. It's always great talking to you.
Yes, indeed. If you'll wait right there, I will be right back. Hey, thanks for enjoying this episode all the way to the end. Please give us a like and subscribe to this channel. This has been a production of PositiveTalkRadio.net. Please visit our website, oddly named PositiveTalkRadio.net, for more details about us and our mission, which is to provide great positive programming designed to inspire us all. I'm Kevin McDonald, and I'm proud of these shows, and I truly hope that you'll like them and share them with friends and family. So on behalf of our entire team, remember, be kind to one another, because each other's all we got.